Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Really appreciate this hearing. Very timely, very critical. COVID has shined a light, as some of our witnesses have showed us, on the need for this type of program going forward in this very complex world we live in. I guess biggest concern I have is, I guess I address comment to Dr. Yamamoto, is how do we assure that ARPA-H is not, frankly, just doing the research that industry would do anyway? I mean, how do we make sure that we're complementary and assisting and getting to what industry cannot afford to do, that high risk beyond which they draw the line? How do we evaluate that?
I think this really depends on the wisdom and insights of the program directors, program managers, to be able to identify de-risking opportunities, areas where industry can't afford to go or feel that there's not not a big enough market, or that the challenge for getting to across the Valley of Death is too great to risk economically. And those opportunities are actually all around us. They're really at the heart of why it takes a median time of 32 years to move from a basic research discovery to an approved drug. And so we will be able to find within ARPA-H program managers that have identified or maybe even lived those block barriers, and it will come into ARPA-H. These program managers, by the way, get their jobs by competing with each other to come to the director of the agency and say, I have a problem that I think really needs to be solved, right? And I have a way that I think it can be solved, and here's what it's going to take to get there, right? And a part of that evaluation and that the director will make is, what's unique about this? There's something called the Heilmar Catechism that says, what's unique about this where it's not being done elsewhere? And what is it that you think can be done that makes it specifically an ARPA-like project?
All right, very good, thank you. I guess that brings up the second question I had, I guess Dr. Lang or whoever. I mean, the question of intellectual property. With the collaboration between the government and government equals taxpayer, and industry, which equals shareholder, and how do we allocate the intellectual property rights in those types of collaborations? What's been done? Mike.
That's already been legislated, Congressman. The Biodole Act of 1980, and then the federal regulations, the contract for federal regulations are very clear. The IP belongs to the private entity. The U.S. government doesn't make anything. They don't own any factories. So the intellectual property actually belongs to the
Even in a case where we're going beyond just basic research, I understand that argument with basic research, but now that we're going into applied research, should that still apply in that?
To my understanding, it does, Congressman. The one thing that I point out, though, in all contracts, not grants, but contracts, is march-in rights. The U.S. government reserves the right to march in. They can create exceptions that allow them to march in. They can march in because the private partner did not commercialize it within an X period of time.
March in meaning they can acquire those rights?
Oh, absolutely. They can call it, at DARPA, we used to call it clawback.
Okay, very good. I guess last question for Dr. Crowfaw. Discussed a little bit about we need both NCAT and ARPA-H. What's the difference and why do we need both?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the broad portfolio for NCATs is actually quite diverse in terms of their reach and the activities. A large part of the portfolio funds the CTSAs. These are the academic institutions that are quite focused on translational research, and that needs to continue. It's about 80% of NCAT's budget. They help to talk about issues such as de-risking, how to get through that valley of death, but really in a significant way that affects the entire sector, the entire industry. NCAT also has programs, for example, the tissue chip program, Organ of the Chip, for example. They also have programs on rare diseases. Some of these programs may be appropriate for an ARPA-H-like entity, and others may not be necessarily appropriate for an ARPA-H-like entity. When we're talking about the kind of high-risk, high-reward projects that would be captured under an ARPA-H, those types of projects will be quite distinct in supporting the overall field for example, of translational sciences, which includes things like capturing the clinical trial inventory, which happened during COVID-19. Those CTS-8 that I mentioned also contributed their data into a platform called NC3, which allowed all of that data that's being generated in these clinical trials and studies in academic settings to be mined for insights for COVID-19. Those kinds of programs ought to continue at NCATS and may not be the right types of projects for ARPA-H.
Very good. Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.